I'll start. Let me just pray to start. Yeah, Father, we just ask that you would speak to us now through your word, God. As we've been looking at the fruits of the Spirit, what it means to take on your character in our lives by walking in the Spirit. God, we just ask that you'd come with us now, Jesus. Holy Spirit, come, and wherever we are right now, would you just come and just, stir up our hearts, God, to hear from you, God, to be responding to you. Father, whatever words that I say, God, what I want for each one of us is that we come to hear you and hear your voice. So, Jesus, would you speak to us this afternoon, I pray. Amen. We're going to continue our series on the fruits of the Spirit from the passage in Galatians 5, the letter to the Galatian church, and chapter 5. If you've got a Bible and you want to turn to that, it's kind of helpful, I think, if you have got that in front of you at all, or if you've got it on your phone or whatever. And it's from verse 16 onwards, but I'm just going to read it to you. So I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with each other, so that you are not to do whatever you want. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. The acts of the flesh are obvious: sexual immorality, impurity and debauchery, idolatry and witchcraft, hatred and discord and jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions and envy, drunkenness, orgies, and the like. And I warn you, as I did before, that those who live like this will not inherit the kingdom of God. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law. Those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. Since we live by the Spirit, let's keep in step with the Spirit. Let us not become conceited, provoking and envying each other. Paul, who wrote that 2,000 years ago, reminds us that life walking in the Spirit is how we live a fruitful life. The fruit's God's character. God's plan is that through his Spirit, we're to show this same fruit in our lives. Who wouldn't want to be more joyful or loving or faithful or peaceful or patient? And today I'm going to look at just one of those fruits, continuing in the series, and it's this fruit of peace. What does peace mean? Especially in a world where we seem so far from it. Division is seen between races and families and countries. And perhaps most disturbing of all, we see it in those that claim to love Jesus, the Prince of Peace, his church. And we're going to look at the ultimate source of peace and look at living in peace with others, or at least what life might look like if we're living to seek for this. But I want to start by just sharing a bit of my story, where peace has played its part at different points. And it starts with my coming to peace with God just over 20 years ago. This meeting with Jesus is key for me and all other kind of peace that I've had ever since. Despite having at the time a decent job, a house, a car, some good mates, I had a load of baggage as well. And I was angry and I was judgmental and I was full of unforgiveness. And I felt justified in blaming a lot of my problems on other people. I didn't like who I'd become, but I also realized that I couldn't change myself. Surrendering to Jesus changed me, realizing that his love for me changed my heart in a way that I can't still fully explain. But there was no doubt that a peace had settled in my heart. Such was the change that God did in me that about a year later, I ended up moving and working in a Christian night shelter. And its vision was to be a place of safety and peace and welcoming for the homeless of the town, and a place where people could know some sort of peace. But keeping the peace in that kind of environment wasn't easy. There were some people there that would come in and they would bully and threaten other people. And so as volunteers, our job was to be the peacekeepers. And sometimes this meant barring people, asking them to leave, those that were intent on trouble. And again, it wasn't easy, knowing that you was going to put someone back out on the streets. But let's remember, when we're following Jesus, that acting justly and defending the vulnerable can lead to conflict. When in time in that night shelter, I took on a leadership position there, I found a new challenge. Sometimes the Christians that were the volunteers, they just didn't get on with each other. And my first reaction was just frustration with them. Shouldn't they know better? We're here to serve the homeless. And I was here refereeing Christians who should know better. But again, God just opened my eyes again to have compassion on the team and see that peace and unity needed to be worked out amongst Jesus's family. And there was another further step in all of that, which was those folks that had been barred from the night shelter due to their sort of aggression and their dangerous behaviour. Once a week, I'd have to travel into town to a statue, which was kind of a meeting point, and talk to them about how could we work this out. This was difficult for me because perhaps the night before we'd had the police in, or we'd had someone threatening us, to do us harm, and knowing that the next day I was going to walk into town and be a sitting duck at this statue. So praying before those moments for peace was just so important for me to have courage, but also peace for that person. That somehow we could work it out, we could move forward. And God was really gracious to me. And I can remember some powerful conversations with people, some acceptance of the impact of their behaviours on others, and the importance of forgiveness and second chances or third chances or seven chances. And this little bit of my story kind of sums up what I want to say about peace this afternoon. Because without peace with God, I couldn't find a lasting peace. And peace due to your circumstances is great, but it lasts for a time. It doesn't deal with the root problem, the part of us that wars against God. But true peace with God never stops with just coming to God. It flows outward. It touches every other relationship that we have, those in God's family, the church, the wider world, and even those that are hostile to us. Jesus says this, love your enemies and do good to them and pray for them. So when Paul writes this in his letter, what does he have in mind when he talks about this fruit of peace to the Galatians, this small church in the Roman Empire? First, if you turn back, if you do just remember that passage, what Paul does is he contrasts two things. He says these two things, these fruits, are in contrast and conflict with the acts of the sinful nature. And it roots fruit in a very realistic portrayal of the world as it is. And you don't have to live on the planet long before you realise that it's just not all tickety-boo, is it? Paul doesn't write to the Galatians when he's sitting in some sort of health spa, he's overlooking some beautiful mountains and lakes, and he's sipping on a cocktail and he's listening to whale music. That's just not where he is. He's immersed in this world of violence, of sexual exploitation, of oppression, of warring factions, of abuses of power, of poverty, sickness and death. Paul writes elsewhere of his own shameful past and how he was one of the bullies of this world. He's as guilty as anyone about what's wrong with things. And the kind of people that Paul was writing to, they're born into that same kind of world. The Galatians were a group of tribes, and they were historically known as scrappers and fighters. And it was only in the last 50 to 100 years before Paul wrote to them that actually what had happened is the Roman Empire had moved in and imposed its own kind of peace on them. And it's perhaps the sort of peace that we're kind of used to in our world. It's a peace based on fear and power. And as one writer puts it about it, the peace for the Romans was this: when all opponents had been beaten down and lost their ability to resist. So Paul is writing to a church that is grounded in reality, real people, real lives, messy, and not a million miles from what we see around us in our situations and on the news every day. And it's really important that we get this, Because I don't think Paul is really talking about a kind of peace that happens when you get into sort of, finding a Zen-like state in a health spa. It's to do with a contrast with a world of discord, jealousy, infighting, fits of rage and selfishness. And before we run away with ourselves and start looking elsewhere at those with those sort of problems, we need to take a long, good look at our own lives, our own close relationships. And as we look for lives that produce fruit, self-examination is a really good starting point. So what is the true source of peace? A lot of the time, we try to create peace with our own efforts. We plan our lives around us to maximize calm and insulate us from the harm around us. We're told to cut the toxic people out of our lives, but only a brief glance at the news, even today, and we see what non-peace looks like. That situation at the moment, terrible in Israel and Gaza at the moment, and the countless other places that don't even hit the headlines every day. But I want to suggest that the causes of conflict, we have to look much closer to home. Conflict, like a raging forest fire, starts with a small spark. I read the other day about a thing called the Pig Wars. It's worth looking up. In the 1800s, it was a war between America, or a state of war between America and Britain. It started on a small island when one farmer fell out with his neighbor and ended up shooting his neighbor's pig. And within months, both these farmers' nations had managed to post warships and thousands of troops to the area ready to start a full-scale bust-up. It took 12 years before eventually a treaty meant that everyone could just go home. And a Russian writer, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, imprisoned for his views during the years of Stalin in Russia, he wrote this: "If only it was this simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously doing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart?" See, he's right. The real problem in finding peace in the world comes from our hearts. And Jesus said it's similar. It's what's deep down inside of us that is the cause of evil. And I think if we're brave enough to look, we know we are the problem. We want to be peaceful people, joy, more patient, loving people. But try as we might, we just can't do it. And the history of humankind has surely taught us that much. And if we're honest with ourselves, our own history probably tells us that. And it's been quite common recently, I don't know if you noticed this pattern of celebrities that have posted, like in their history, something on social media that's come back to them. And the standard response that you'll see often is, "I'm sorry, I've grown as a person and I will try harder in the future." And I'm not doubting the sincerity of what some of those people say, although I know some of it's probably for the sponsors as well. But my own experience is this try harder next time just isn't enough. And the Galatians that Paul writes to, like Paul, had come to realize that trying harder mentality just wasn't enough. And with it actually just comes more misery as you fail. For peace, they needed to come to the source of peace. And Paul told them of a God who actually cares about justice, mercy, peace, and truth. And that is a wonderful thought, but actually it's also a terrible thought. It does mean that no injustice will ever be overlooked. It does mean that no lie will ever not be uncovered. And that, to me, sounds good when I think about some of the terrible crimes that have been committed and some of the terrible injustices that are out there. But actually, it also sounds terrifying to me when I think that every moment of my own life is under examination in the same way. And if that was all that Paul told them, what hope is there for any of us? But it wasn't. He told them then about Jesus, the one who would come to take away these burdens. Our mistakes, our constant trying harder and harder, it could be lifted from us. And the good news was that Jesus had come to be our peace with God. Trusting in Jesus brought them a peace that their own efforts couldn't. And Paul writes this to another church. He writes in Romans 5 verse 1. He says, therefore, since we've been made right in God's sight by faith, we have peace with God because of what Jesus Christ has done for us. But what triggers Paul's letter, his biggest concern at the point and when he writes to them, is to say that having got to this place of peace as a people, they were now thinking of going back to a try harder mentality. And his whole letter to them is about that actually peace was a gift to them, a gift from God. Jesus and his Spirit are the gift. This lasting peace can't be earned, it's freely given. And Jesus had this peace his whole life. At his arrest, when he's about to be taken and then killed, his friends all draw their swords to try and fight them off. And he calls them to peace. And it's why Paul, who writes this letter, in another letter, he's writing from a prison cell. And he can say, even in these circumstances, I can know peace. And it's the same peace that I experienced on my lounge floor 20 years ago when I came to God in surrender. And I gave up my way and I offered up my mistakes. And I said, Jesus, you're enough. Jesus, you're the peace terms. Your life is enough. And it's the same peace that I found when the hours before I went and met these rather aggressive people that had been barred, that I know anything could happen. It's the same peace I found before that when I got before God. And I want to just encourage you in this time of thinking about the fruits. One writer said this, get into the habit of preaching the good news of Jesus to yourself every day, because he is my peace. I don't need any other. And when Jesus prays for his followers, he reminds them that it's his peace that he's giving to them, and that it's going to come in spite of the difficulties that they will face in their lives. So let Jesus be your source of peace, and he won't let you down. But here's the thing, it's bigger than that. It's not just about me and God, because there's no peace if there isn't peace with others. And this is my second point about peace. We find our true peace with God, but his peace doesn't stop there. Like ripples when they hit a pool, it spreads out. Knowing peace with God will and should affect every relationship we have, good and bad. Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. We look like the family that's raised us. When we know God as our Father, we come to be like him. And when we're immersed in a family, we take on the characteristics and the culture of that family. God sent Jesus as his peace offering to us, and he wants us to take the peace that he's giving us outward to all of our relationships. When out of safety for everyone in the night shelter, I asked someone to leave, that, I barred them or whatever, I'd often get this drunken accusation, call yourself a Christian. Even if they couldn't see that at the time I was thinking about everyone's safety, they did understand something. People who know Jesus should be peace-loving, they should be kind, they should be merciful. They're supposed to be like him. And being a peacemaker is more than just keeping your head down as the bullets fly in the world around us. We're supposed to take an active part. We're in the world. We're not of it, but we are in it. And if you should go to a cabinet maker's shop, you wouldn't expect them to be sitting around with a bunch of planks and wood all lying around them and expecting the wood to assemble itself. They're making cabinets, hammering, sawing, sweating over their work. That's what cabinet makers do. What about peacemakers? We're called as children of God to be actively making and maintaining peace. Peacemaking is a creative act. We're to work for peace in a hostile world with our lives poured out in love and compassion and for people. It's part of what is God's family business. And I think one of the things that really grieves God's heart more than anything else is the infighting in his church, his family. As a father, even if I'm getting on really well with my kids, if I see them not getting on with each other, I'm really deeply saddened. Getting on with one another in the church promises to bring people to know Jesus. In John 13:35, it says, "By this, everyone will know that you're my disciples, if you love one another." And a great privilege for me in being part of a church in Bromsgrove has been my involvement with Street Pastors, a project that's about showing compassion and kindness out on the town centre on Friday nights, to be a calming influence, to help those who are a bit worse for wear on drink or drugs get home safely. But what I love about this is the meeting and spending time with other Christians from other churches, people who love Jesus, Christians that have different views about a whole load of stuff to me, but who love Jesus and want to make that love known. And I don't know how God's going to sort out the rights and the wrongs of all those different views, but I know he will be pleased with the way Street Pastors share Jesus's love and mercy. And understanding that there's no peace with God without it overflowing into every other relationship helps us to get the fruit of peace isn't found in this spa retreat idea. It's found in the midst of our circumstances and the messy relationships we have. Jesus was a man of peace, not because of his circumstances, but in spite of them. His relationship with God, moment by moment, was his source of peace. He was able to pass that on to others. This daily walking with the Spirit of God. What are we like in our closest relationships? As one writer puts it, do our lives produce more heat or light? How did I deal with the last conflict, the difficult relationship that I faced? So I've got 10 more minutes. With the last 10 minutes, I want to raise 3 questions for us to think about and how we embrace God's peace. And the first one is this: is conflict a bad thing? Is the problem conflict, or is it how we resolve it? Can we have different views on things with neither of them being better or worse? I want for dinner tonight. Is that better and worse than what Felicity, my wife, wants, or what the kids want? As we walk with one another in the Spirit, will all of our differences just magically disappear? All of our different opinions? See, I don't think all conflict and difference is bad. God makes us different. When God makes us in his image, there's a difference right there in that first couple of chapters of Genesis. It says male and female, and he made them. See, we all have the Creator's blueprint, but we're all different. Our likes and our dislikes, our choices, our opinions, our personalities. Of course, is every opinion elsewhere equally valued in every conversation? Of course it isn't. A preference for a continual diet of Coke and pizza and burgers may need a bit of adjustment. But the point that is, in a world of difference, we're really quick to draw the battle lines. But in encountering difference and conflict, our first response is not to win a battle. Our first response is to see the person on the other side of the battle lines, that one that is made in the image of God. So when I lay into them and I say, and I write them off, and I say, your opinion is wrong, and no matter how right I might be or how wrong they are, what I'm doing is creating vandalism on the God's image. The letter 1 John, the one with God is love in it, it's great to read because as it makes plain, anyone that says that they love God and not others is in fact a liar. And that makes perfect sense. You can't say you like me or you love me and then go round and clobber my son Joel, or you can't then go and slag off my daughter May. You can't say you love me and do those things. When we start to see God's image in others, people that we strongly disagree with, are difficult to get on with, or just plain horrible, then our thinking and our hearts shift. There are some very evil things done by people, and God's image in people can sometimes look corrupted beyond all recognition. But I am saying that each person has an inbuilt worth or value. Perhaps when we start to see the other person on the other side of the battle lines, we see more of God, what God sees in them than when we first realised. And then comes this next stage, doesn't it, in moving away from peace, which is once we've drawn our battle lines, like the wrong pig farmer, what we do is we gather our army. We don't deal with the conflict with that person. We get a load of people around us that support our views. We tell our best friend or our work colleague, and we share it with the life group for prayer, of course. We read books and we listen to things that support our view. We put a Facebook post up and see how many likes we get on it. We love the support of our view. Yeah, I find them a bit difficult too. Did I tell you about what they did to me? We had one memorable night a few years ago. We run an outreach called Open Doors in Charford. And two of the lads at the thing, I can't remember, they were 14 or so years old. And they had this major disagreement over something. I can't even remember what it was. But the situation escalated. And it wasn't long before the whole of the car park, we had loads of screaming and shouting. And all these parents and friends of these lads came along. They weren't seeking peace. They were there to choose sides. And I just remember running around this car park trying to put out these fires of aggression. Instead of gathering our army of supporters, how different is Jesus when he speaks about dealing with conflict in Matthew 18? If your brother wrongs you, what do? You go to him to make it right. Could Jesus ever have given us any more concrete steps? Go to them, take someone else if that's needed, not post it on Facebook, not send them a text or an email, but go to them. See them as your brother or sister. Why should I? They're the ones that are in the wrong. I'll wait for them to come to me. Let them make the first move. What's the point anyway? They'll never change. It might be awkward. Scratch that. It will be awkward. But do it to win them over. And as a church, part of our commitment as a membership is that following the steps in Matthew 18 with one another. And because it's done in such a discreet way, I don't know how often it's practiced, but I know in my own experience, it's rare. And though recently I did have an opportunity where someone, and me and someone else had a bit of an issue. So we got another person along, a mediator, to help us. And I didn't know this third person, but they did, and I trusted them enough to know that it would be someone, it would be a good choice. It was humbling, the experience. The guy who helped us talk through this issue, he was a great guy. He was really wise. And we walked and we talked, and you can tell it was in lockdown at the time. Have all the issues gone away? No, not completely. But I tell you what, as I listened, I found myself having a growing compassion for this other person. And it took time. We could have both of us brushed the issue under the carpet, or we could have gone our separate ways. But I'm glad that we've stayed in this, fighting for unity, for peace between brothers. And in Matthew 18 on peacemaking, Jesus finishes with this verse in verse 20. It says, "For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am with them." We tend to use this or think of this in prayer meetings, but it's right there in sorting out conflict. Jesus' presence is found when we give ourselves over to working out disagreement. And we sometimes assume going into that Jesus is with us on our side. But where is he found? Not on our side, not with them, but when we come together. We surely will at times disagree, let each other down badly. Jesus gives a way forward in peace. To see them as God's image bearers, precious in his sight, to humbly cross the battle lines, to own our own mistakes and forgive one another. Walking in the Spirit is walking towards conflict. We're ambassadors to take his message of peace to the world, called to take it into conflict and disagreement. The Spirit gives us the courage to go to such places with his love. And my second question is this: when is enough enough? You might be thinking, Steve, this is all well and good, but seriously, there are some pretty bad people out there. Isn't there a time when we've just got to call it quits? The Bible isn't naive to what the world's like. Paul writes this in Romans 12:18. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Is there a little bit of a get out clause in there? It won't always go well. Some people won't be won over, no matter how hard we try. But my question is this: what is possible? One day we will stand before Jesus in his presence, and he may well ask us this question: in that conflict with so-and-so, did you do everything that was possible? Did you really? And the other thing you might be thinking is, yes, but this all takes quite a lot of time. This meeting up with someone, then bringing someone else along, and they're pretty busy too. And then you want me to get all the elders together, and then you want me to get the whole church together. It does seem like a waste of time. Well, that marriage that's hanging by a thread, is counselling. It seems like such hard work. Is it worth it? Or that difficult work colleague or member of staff or kid in the school, can't I just avoid them? Go our separate ways? Or those groups that's never going to agree, they're just poles apart. What's the point in trying? All these efforts in peacemaking seem so wasteful. But in all of these things, let's keep our eye on what is a fruitful life. If God's measure of fruitfulness is showing these things, love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control, faithfulness, is that what will really count as a life well lived? See, that's pretty different to my ideas or some of my ideas or the world's ideas of productivity. What do we prioritize? What do we define as success? Peacemaking seems inefficient, wasteful, but don't mistake activity for productivity. I'm restlessly active all the time. I'm always doing stuff. But how often do I look at what is productive? What's going to matter in the end? What is going to matter to Jesus? What is a productive life? Every other Friday, we run a group for people affected in some way by addictions. And when you've lived with someone who's lied to you a lot or stolen from you or promised to change countless times before, you've got to ask the question, when is enough enough? It's an important question. And many of us can perhaps think of things that are unforgivable. If they did that, how could I possibly forgive them? Even in the Bible, it says in a few places that there is some stuff that seems unforgivable. But there are also times when we disagree and we stand at opposite ends of a subject. What's the point of trying to work this out? And all of this may be true, but I know for me, I give up far too soon. I've got a little reserve of mercy, a few pounds of credit in the bank of mercy, and it's all quickly used up. Jesus knows that. Choosing division, to go differently, to go our separate ways, I can do that well enough alone without Jesus. But to stick in relationships, to be at peace with everyone, if it is at all possible, requires drawing on God's grace. And we need Jesus in a way that disunity or division never does. Choosing peace will seem wasteful, and it's not always possible. But just perhaps things become more possible when we walk with the Spirit of God. And this final question, just one more minute. Am I a hedgehog or am I a rhino? On a marriage course I did some years ago, someone once said, you either handle conflict like a rhino or a hedgehog. The rhino meets conflict head on, head down. It lets rip in conflict and it charges anyone down that's in its path. But when you're a hedgehog, when conflict happens and you're a hedgehog, you curl up, you retreat into yourself and you put your spikes up. Nothing's coming near me. And neither of these two approaches are particularly helpful when it comes to peace. If we charge into conflict, we're giving no thought to the other person. But if we curl up and put up our spikes and our barriers and avoid them, then we never allow that relationship to grow. Like I said, not all conflict's bad. It's an opportunity for growth. Those of us that are rhinos need the Spirit of God in us to give us gentleness for one another. And those of us that are hedgehogs need perhaps just a bit the Spirit to give us some courage to step out in faith. We're called to live fruitful lives, resting in the peace that God has freely given us and active in that peace, in peacemaking in a broken world. Jesus, near the end of his life, he made this promise to us. In John 14:27, it said, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. I do not give as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid." Jesus' peace isn't like any others. It changes us in how we face the world that is bruised and battered by the way we tear each other apart. My prayer for us this week is that we find his peace, and in being his children, have the courage and compassion to bring peace in every encounter we have.